Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again. Today's video is going to be a bit of a strange one, is because today I want to talk about romance in fantasy and science fiction stories. And yes, by romance I do mean things like love scenes, sex scenes, this sort of thing. While I will mention a number of book series, and while I'll allude maybe to some of the romantic relationships within those series, I'll try my best to steer clear of any specifics, any spoilers. So yeah, don't worry about that. Also, if you haven't already, it really would mean a lot if you could please like, subscribe, share, all that fun stuff. So, a bit of background on why I want to talk about this. I'd say less than a year ago, when I started this channel, I honestly expected to keep most of my videos pretty focused and specific to Steven Erikson and Ian C. Esselmont and their Malazan epic fantasy books, their different series in that Malazan universe. None of their works dive really too far into the tropes and conventions of romance stories. And I'd even say some readers of Erikson in particular they can be critical of how so much of his amorous scenes and relationships take place off page. And yeah, so with that original focus being Malazan for my channel, I really didn't plan on talking about romance and sex scenes and this sort of thing. Didn't plan on talking about it much at all. But then I kind of started to take a long, hard look at what I'd been currently reading, what I have been reading, and I noticed more and more romance was creeping its way into my interests. I have been reading Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series, a time travel historical fiction romance series, and I've been loving it. I also joined a book club with my fiance and her friends, and through that, most of what we read were either murder mystery, suspense type of books, or romances. Once or twice, leaning more towards the smuttier side of romance. Penelope Douglas's Punk 57 in particular jumps to mind. And while even that book wasn't too terribly spicy, it still was definitely more on that, like, again, quote-unquote smuttier kind of end of the romance spectrum. Currently, at the recommendation of my fiance and friends, I've been reading Sarah J. Maas's ACOTAR, or A Court of Thorns and Roses series. I'm only 2 books in, but I'd say things are definitely starting to heat up in a number of ways, including how detailed the descriptions of love scenes are in that series. And I am enjoying that series as well. So with this new subgenre and type of storyline, these romances, anything to do with romance was really finding its way into my reading habits more and more, and I was finding that I was thoroughly enjoying these books for the most part, and the love scenes, they either didn't bother me or I felt most of the time that they actually enhanced the stories in a number of ways. But maybe now would be a good time to talk about why they might be uncomfortable for some readers, why sex scenes might make some of us cringe a little bit. And surely it's no great leap in logic to say that sex can make people a little bit uncomfortable, conversations about sex. Maybe it's just from how, like, a lot of Western societies and like children in these places are raised without a ton of exposure to sex or conversations about sex. Kind of just with the hushed whispers and jokes about it being, or about sex being the extent of many people's educational experience in, like, a lot of public school systems, unfortunately. And so, sex is often thought of as kind of a naughty or dirty thing, and there might be an element of shame, and definitely an element of privacy in any of us getting enjoyment out of sex scenes in books, and any conversations about sex, that sort of thing. Other hurdles to how approachable this particular type of scene or this particular type of story could be. Other hurdles: sex depicted on screen often demands a higher age rating than, say, extreme violence or excessive swearing might, so depictions of sex simply aren't as accessible. They just don't find their way into those scenes very much. Other things, I suspect certain political, religious, and other leaders in society in certain countries have decided to force their own personal family-esque moral codes and what they're uncomfortable with they've forced societies around them to adapt their same sensitivities. It's just a theory, but I don't think it's a particularly unrealistic theory. For all of these reasons and more, we have much less exposure to descriptive and detailed sex scenes and instances of sex being involved in storytelling than we have of descriptive and detailed violent scenes, battle scenes, that sort of thing being involved in our stories. So now that I've addressed, or at least introduced, the issue of how uncomfortable these scenes can make some of us, the main point of this video today is I want to think about why authors would incorporate sex scenes into their stories. And I think I've put together a list of 3 specific reasons why it might be a great bonus or benefit for an author to depict sex in their works. So, number 1. It's a natural part of life, and for many of the readers out there, sex can be a very relatable moment. Now, the flip side of this is when all of an author's scenes have this picture-perfect, always ideal, always glamorous and hot, steamy, kind of perfect element to them. The next time you read a sex scene, I think it would be a good exercise to ask yourself how relatable what is happening actually is. If it's super relatable and believable for the characters to be acting in this way, I think it can make for a more compelling reading experience and can make for more believable and rich characters. But if the scenes are depicted in this kind of weirdly perfect, always sexy, like always, hot and heavy kind of way, well, then it's probably serving more of like an escapist function, more of like a dream satisfaction kind of fantasy function. It's probably just serves as a thrilling scene that makes readers wish they were in the character's shoes or sheets, There is nothing wrong with either approach that an author takes, the more realistic or the more fantastic, dreamlike, but it can be helpful to consider what approach the author is taking. I would go on to argue that, especially in the greater genre of sci-fi and fantasy, I think it can help ground the reader experience in more human and realistic emotions, the more realistically sex scenes are written, and I believe specifically, I think Diana Gabaldon does this extremely well. That was the first thing I think we should pay attention to when we look at a sex scene. How realistic is it? Is the author intending for this to be realistic or not? Number 2, I think what we should look at. For most audiences out there, sex is a very private, intimate thing. And in a way, I always find that when an author lets us into the sex scene itself, they're letting us see an extremely private part of their characters' lives. And I think it's a level of closeness that is hard to beat with any other type of scene. It's almost like the author is sacrificing their characters' privacy and their characters' most private moments, trusting that audiences will approach the scenes with a level of maturity and respect. At worst, however, I do think this can lead us to feel like we're kind of invading on the character's privacy, but at least this can be one of my favorite things, but at best, this can be one of my favorite things about sex scenes. At best, we're getting a more complete picture of who the characters are, and we're given more information to better understand maybe their motivations, why they go on to make important plot developing decisions later on. Along these lines, I often find sex scenes work particularly well in the already more intimate first-person point of view, like we get in Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses. To give us that really kind of, we're in her private mind, we're in her immediate head. Diana Gabaldon also uses the first person as well. Moving on to the third and final point I want to mention in this video. Last but not least, from a pure stylistic kind of narrative construction or like a storytelling standpoint, I think authors can use these sex scenes to communicate tons of information to the reader without having to rely on too much exposition or dialogue. Maybe, especially in some fantasy sci-fi stories, to get readers grounded in the world, there might need to be a little bit more exposition, a little bit more dialogue going into all of these things. But maybe So maybe there's been a lot of that in the 100 or so pages before a sex scene happens. But then a sex scene, the scene itself, can serve as a great setting for the sort of to shift over into that show don't tell style. Not only is the author able to subtly then communicate a lot of character information to us just by the way the characters are feeling about the romance that and the intimacy that's happening there, but this can also be a way for characters to kind of communicate a lot with each other without having to say anything. Either, maybe they are saying things, but they're just saying things through innuendo or euphemisms. Sometimes they're not saying anything at all and just using sort of that physical touch love language to communicate a ton of information. So those are just a few of the different analytical approaches, or maybe not analytical approaches, but at least things I think we can keep in mind the next time we come across a sex scene. These moments can serve more of a significant purpose than just this kind of climactic, cheap payoff or quick thrill that I think they're often seen as at first glance. And I think we can try and use these scenes to understand not only the characters more thoroughly, but also the author's various approaches to storytelling and trying to communicate information about their world to us. So there you have it. Definitely a more ideas-driven video for today, but as this is, I believe, an important part of my personal journey with reading, I wanted to share this with all of you. And furthermore, I would love to hear back from all of you why you might love certain romantic scenes or romance authors, but maybe consider others pretty cringy or unrealistic. Maybe why you're not comfortable reading about sex. Which, by the way, if this wasn't clear, there's nothing wrong with not being too comfortable reading about sex. It's definitely a preference, taste sort of thing. I'm not saying everyone should enjoy these scenes. It can definitely be an acquired taste. The sex scenes in books, they do come with a certain number of drawbacks, of course, such as the repetitive innuendos and euphemisms all over the place. At the light end of the bad things about sex scenes, you just see these same phrases and these same, other ways to talk about body parts and stuff. You see them repeated time and time again in different books, different series. That is kind of the lighter side of what's not good about sex scenes. But then, of course, on the more serious, heavier end, clearly not all authors who write sex scenes and romance, they're not all the most trauma-informed, or they don't all take the most cautious approach to writing more risque sex scenes, especially. And sometimes those scenes can dip a little bit too closely into like sexual harassment or even sexual assault territory for me to be comfortable with them. I could do a whole video about those negative aspects, but today I really wanted to focus more on the positive, and I hope maybe I've given you all some more things to think about, and maybe new ways to approach your reading of a sex scene the next time you come across one. All that said, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.